Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. Happy last week of August.
That's right, and it's been a long summer, Tim. So you actually watched the debate among the candidates in the recall. And this time there was actually a Democrat participating, Kevin Paffrath. Am I saying that right? He's a real estate broker. I didn't watch it. I was pretty much glued to the coverage in Kabul airport. But how was it?
Well, all these debates are kind of about the same. It was interesting to have a Democrat on the stage. He's an interesting fellow. He said, and you could kind of have a little drinking game going if you were listening to him. He said about 100 times, I'm a JFK style Democrat. So if that was on your bingo card, you would probably be drunk by the end of the debate. And he has a lot of ideas, which are interesting, but they come across as kind of, I'm going to snap my fingers and do it. And I couldn't help myself, but when I was sitting there listening to him thinking, he said something to the effect of, we're going to have homeless cleaned up off the streets of California in either 60 or 90 days. And I said, let me introduce you to the California legislature and see how that goes. And let me introduce you to various groups who will sue you in court. So, it was interesting. He kept trying to say, too, that there was one poll that actually isn't a very reliable poll where he showed, I think he was at 13 or 14% of the vote. So he kept trying to say that he had more support than everybody on the stage combined, and called on everybody else to drop out. So I don't know. I mean, I think it is clear that there are a number of Democratic voters who are not heeding the advice to leave the second question blank and are looking for somebody to vote for. And in the polling that's come out, pretty clear, he is getting a percentage of Democrats to vote for him. Whether it would be enough for him to overtake Larry Elder is another question, but he seems to be pretty consistently among candidates, not counting I left it blank or not sure. He's running consistently second in these polls, though far behind Larry Elder. So I don't know if we're going to have any other debates. I think this might have been the last one announced, but this was now the fourth debate that we have had. But it was a different dynamic to see an actual Democrat on the stage.
So what about the Republicans? Any of them stick out, or was there pretty much same as the others?
I would say everybody has been about on par in every debate. So the other candidates who were on stage at this last debate were Assemblyman Kevin Kiley from the Sacramento area, Mayor Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego, and businessman John Cox, who was the Republican candidate for governor in the last election. And they kind of stuck to their themes. I wouldn't say that any of them had a better or worse performance or did something different or made any real mistakes. I think they all have kind of a comfort level of a pitch that they make to voters, and I think they all, do it reasonably well. So I don't know that anybody really stood out overall as the winner of the debate. I'm sure they all will send out a press release saying they were the winner, as what you do in a debate. But they all kind of did what they thought they needed to do.
So now there's also some new polling out on the candidates. And this one is showing the no's are much higher than the yeses from previous polls. I like what Real Clear Politics does, which is to average out the polls. But my instinct is that the race is closer than we think. So what do you think about these polls?
Well, this latest poll is from a group called Change Polls, and they're a Democratic affiliated polling firm. And they also do their polling online. So take that for what it's worth. But it shows that the no's are winning. 57% would vote no, 42% would vote yes. And they also showed that the intensity gap between Democrats and Republicans has been closed, and that over 90% of Democrats now are planning to participate in the election. Well, if that is the case on election day, well, we probably would see see an outcome somewhere like this. That's been the big question. Can Gavin Newsom motivate Democrats who don't know that there's an election going on or aren't particularly enamored with Newsom or think he has it in the bag to actually come out and vote? He got a bit of a setback last week when there was a planned rally on Friday with Vice President Kamala Harris, and she had to cancel the rally due to the situation in Afghanistan. The Newsom campaign has been hoping that both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden will come out and campaign for him in advance of the election. We'll see how events go, if they'll be able to get away and campaign for him. This poll, whatever you think of it, the first sign that maybe Newsom is getting some Democrats to wake up and come home.
So now you're also following the suspense file hearing in the legislature. This is the hearing where bills go to die. So which major bills are going away?
The suspense file was always the bane of my existence. It's where all of the good bills that I staffed would go to die a quiet, I would argue painful death, but others would say a painless death. And what it is that all bills that cost anything are considered together all at once. And then those that basically the Democratic leadership want to move forward, and those that they want to kill without getting their fingers dirty, die, without a vote even being taken. And so, as I've written on Right by the Bay, this kind of end of session period really is being overshadowed by the recall, certainly, by the wildfires, by the drought, now by Afghanistan. So it isn't, there aren't the exciting bills that you would normally have, but there are some worth noting. One topic that we've written about, and that is an issue in the recall debate, there were several Republican-authored bills to try and fix the problems at the EDD. All of those were killed in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, although the chairwoman, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez-Fletcher, says they're duplicative of other bills that are moving in the Senate. What that means is Democrats have authored their own bills, and those are moving in the Senate. So we will see what happens to those bills, and if any bills do pass that will address some of these outstanding issues with the EDD. Other bills that came up that were interesting. There's a very controversial bill, AB 1395, that would move California to net zero emissions by 2045. And of course, as we've documented, green mandates like that drive up energy costs, drive up costs on business, etc. That bill was approved, so that will be voted on the floor. Overall, there were about 250 bills were approved by Senate appropriations and about 165 by Assembly appropriations, about 75 to 80% pass rate in each house. So you're looking at another about 400 or so bills that will be moving forward in the last few weeks of session. The legislature adjourns for the year on September 10th. So that night when they adjourn, you can all breathe a sigh of relief.
Well, I've been following Prop 22, which listeners might remember is the ballot initiative that carved out an exemption on the state's law that reclassified independent contractors as employees. But despite the fact that the voters have spoken and voted for Prop 22, a judge declared it unconstitutional because it interferes with the legislature's ability to make the drivers eligible for workers' comp benefits. And so the judge decided that the entire law was moot and unconstitutional. Now, Tim, I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds like the judge ruled the whole thing unconstitutional on a technicality. So, I'm a big ride-sharing fan, as you know. I gave up my car and now take Uber and Lyft everywhere. And drivers who really were, I think, among the heroes during this pandemic are back in limbo again as the state decides their fate. I mean, our lawyers say that this will likely last another year or two in the courts. Our Kerry Jackson, will be following the issue, and listeners can, expect to hear from him in the coming weeks and months on how this moves through the court.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been thought from the beginning that the U.S. Supreme Court will ultimately decide this issue, and or maybe Congress may decide this issue as well, because there are efforts by the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress to to move toward a similar setup to AB5 at the national level. And so I think this is the first step of many legal ups and downs on this case, and we'll ultimately see what happens. I agree with the punditry that it probably is something that the U.S. Supreme Court will have to resolve at some point.
So our podcast this week features PRI Senior Fellow and economist Wayne Winegarden. And we have this kind of a freewheeling discussion with Wayne about, I'm calling the 3 E's: electricity, environment, and the economy, and everything from infrastructure to the budget reconciliation package. And Wayne is also the director of PRI's Center for Medical Economics and Innovation, and he's working on a project on how drugs should be valued, and he'll have a lot to say about that also in the podcast. And finally, he also answers a big riddle. Why does a smart free market economist move to California? So yes, Wayne Winegarden, our economist, is moving to California. He lives now in the DC area, and he's going to tell us why he wants to move to California. So stay tuned to the end of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and here's Wayne. Wayne, we're delighted to have you back on the podcast. Thanks so much. There's so much going on with all of the areas that you cover that we thought it would be great to have you on for like a Wayne mixtape episode. So let's start with energy policy. PRI scored a big win in the United States Senate recently in the fight over electric car subsidies. Share with our listeners what happened and why it's so important for Congress and other states to not follow California's lead on what we like to call costly subsidies for the rich.
Absolutely. First, it's really great to be back. Always love talking with you guys. And it was certainly gratifying to see our research positively influence what was happening at the debate, even if it was the edges on a really bad bill. The fact that we were able to get it to push to slightly better is really gratifying. I guess if we start with the research, several years ago, we were trying to figure out just how many subsidies are out there for electric vehicles. And I think that's important because even today, if you listen to the politicians, you would think that we don't subsidize electric vehicles. We shouldn't, but we do, and we do to a very, very large extent, which includes at the federal level $7,500. So every time somebody buys a new Tesla or whatever electric vehicle they purchase, they can get $7,500 from the federal government. Now, our research showed, we went and looked at the IRS data, and we said, okay, well, normally, lower income people don't buy Teslas, and so they wouldn't be getting this credit. And lo and behold, 80% of the people who get the credit earn over $100,000 of adjusted gross income, which is slightly less than household income, and 20% are between 50 and 100. So you got 99% of that, credit going to upper income people, which actually even sounds low to me. It should be 100%. And this is what we mean when we're talking about costly subsidies for the rich. We're spending lots of money to give tax credits to rich people who would probably buy a Tesla anyway. And so what was really gratifying is that this is what they brought up on the floor of the Senate. And they cited our research, and they said, most of the subsidy goes to the rich. And so they capped it. And so if this bill were to go through, anyone earning more than $100,000 could no longer claim this credit. And so that's a little bit of a victory for taxpayers, that we're going to stop subsidizing rich people when they go and purchase their electric vehicles.
So staying on this energy theme, PRI recently launched a great new resource called the Electricity Reality Report, which any of our listeners who are interested can go over and check it out at electricityrealityreport.org. And the site focuses on the importance of expanding competition in electricity markets. So what will those who are interested in diving deep on energy policy learn when they visit our site?
I think what they're going to learn is they'll start to understand how electricity gets to our homes and start to understand that we can do better, right? Because it's funny because, electricity is something we all take for granted, although we're taking it less and less for granted in California, which is why, going back to our last one, why the rest of the country shouldn't do costly subsidies for the rich, like California. We need to stop subsidizing all of these technologies. I digress. What we're going to learn from electricity reality report, is understanding all of these trends, understanding that how we deliver electricity matters. Right? There's a wholesale market for electricity. We now have competition where it's no longer just one utility generates the power, then transmits that power to kind of substations, which will then distribute it to customers. We now have competition both at that wholesale level, where different generators can sell and compete with each other to sell electricity onto the grid. We also have in a few states, you could even have choice in who your final kind of utility-like entity is. And we have choice about who we purchase our electricity from. And all of this can improve the service and the quality, as well as reduce prices. All of these types of issues is what we're really diving into in the electricity reality report. It's a little bit of a kind of a top line news, but just understanding these trends, understanding that there are developments happening that we can deliver electricity better, and that there's a lot of benefits to us if we embrace those.
Well, electricity is a big issue these days in California, with the public safety power shutoffs happening in the state because of the massive wildfires. And of course, the mass power blackouts in Texas earlier this year are still in the back of everyone's minds. So you have a new study that will be coming out this fall that documents how consumers will save and reliability will increase if states move away from electricity monopolies and toward a competition. Can you give our listeners a preview?
Absolutely. It's I'm really excited about this study. I'm actually glad you raised it. And it's building off of the electricity reality report. And it was really what I was hoping to do with this, and it's turning out to be the case, is to dive in and to look at the data and what are the data saying. Are there really benefits from competition? We believe there should be, but do those benefits come out in practice? Do they come out at that wholesale level that I was talking about? And do they come out at the retail level? And so it's the study is really a deep dive into these issues, where we explain kind of what a wholesale market is, a regional transmission organization, and what they do, and ISOs, and how does that competition come together, and what are the benefits? And so we look at the pricing, and we see that, in fact, where you have that competition, you do have better pricing, you do have more reliable service, less outages, things of that nature. And the same thing at the retail level, trying to, again, help people think about how competition in electricity can improve their lives. Because I think when people go and they turn on the switch, we just you turn it on and you don't think much about it. Or you just, when you buy, rent a home or buy a home, you don't think about, maybe I could choose my electricity provider. You just call the name that's on the utility. And I think this is providing some of the data to realize that there is something better, that we, by having competition and dispelling the idea that electricity is what economists would call a natural monopoly. And that's not the case. And there's a lot of benefits that we can get if we embrace it. And I think it's also important to note that those benefits also include global climate change. Because, if we can reduce emissions, especially if we can reduce emissions without harming reliability and without raising prices, certainly that's a better situation. Well, competition gives us an ability to balance all these issues and give people the ability to choose, to express their preferences in terms of the source of their power. So you not only have benefits kind of in that traditional way, but there's also benefits in terms of kind of the global climate change issues. So there's just so many ways that customers, which aren't just residential, it's businesses, it's manufacturers, can all benefit if we embrace competition.
So much has been written about this so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill that was approved by the Senate a few weeks back. You wrote a great piece in Forbes that the private sector, rather than the public sector, is much better suited to address big challenges like infrastructure. So explain your thinking here and also share your thoughts on this $1.2 trillion congressional proposal.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we talk about infrastructure. First, everyone's minds tends to go towards roads, bridges, which I think is the right place to go. But then we tend to think of it only as a government kind of entity that, the government owns the infrastructure, public roads, public bridges. And I think it might be shocking to some, but the vast majority of infrastructure is actually privately owned. And I think that one of the best way to envision that is to think about all of the telecom, kind of the 5G commercials we see on the TV that, T-Mobile and Verizon, AT&T, they're all building out, right, the 5G network. That's all private infrastructure. And so and in fact, about 60%, over 60% of the infrastructure by dollar is actually owned by the private sector. The majority of our infrastructure is privately owned. And so in the Forbes piece, I thought that was an important message to get out there, that when we think about upgrading our infrastructure, it's not solely a government responsibility, that a lot of it is private sector. And so when you go to the $1.2 trillion package, and I think it's also important not to ignore the $3.5 trillion coming down the pike behind it, simply because that was very, the negotiation in that really wasn't in good faith, right? I'm going to give, we're going to negotiate a compromise on $1.2 trillion, but everything I give back in that discussion, I'm going to just jam through in the next package. It's hard to understand how that's a compromise, but the idea is in both of those packages, we're making the environment harder for the private sector. So when you talk about, raising taxes, raising spending, the Fed's going to get involved monetizing that debt. So all of that is going to make it harder for the private sector to invest. And so the first kind of issue is, if we want to upgrade our infrastructure, we don't want to be handicapping, the companies that own and the individuals that own all that private infrastructure. And we are. So that's counterproductive. When you start digging into these packages, though, it gets even more difficult. First, and this is especially in the $3.5 trillion package, but it's also in the compromise bill, there's major bait and switch going on, right? They're talking about an infrastructure package, and lots of the infrastructure is daycare or Medicare. And it's not whether or not that spending is important. I mean, we can have a debate and people can talk about why that's a public good with the importance of it, but it's not infrastructure. And it's disingenuous to kind of call that human infrastructure, because you're using the idea that I'm driving on a road with lots of potholes to jam through a completely unrelated government program. And so that's, again, very disingenuous. And I think, and I say this in the Forbes editorial, it's being done because people don't believe the programs can pass on their own merit. So there's some sort of subterfuge trying to call it infrastructure and borrow the goodwill from infrastructure to get a program that wouldn't pass on its own merits. And that's problematic. The other thing that's problematic, and the Democrats and President Biden have done a really good job of minimizing the amount of money we're spending. And I think it's important to put it into perspective. You're talking about between these two packages, and this has nothing to do with all of the money we've already spent with respect to the pandemic. Now it's going to be another $4.7 trillion. It's over a couple of years, but $4.7 trillion, put that into perspective. The entire budget of the federal government before the pandemic, and that was not a lean budget, that was a bloated budget in and of itself, was $4.4 trillion. So we're allocating, we're talking about packages that are bigger than all of the money we spent prior to the pandemic. We're talking about the size of these things is just simply ludicrous. And so I think when you talk about the size of it, when you talk about within that size, there's tons of waste. When you talk about the fact that so much of this is not infrastructure, I haven't even touched upon the fact that so much of the infrastructure, which you could try to kind of force in, is actually the Green New Deal, which again, we can have a debate about whether we should be investing these or not, but to jam through the Green New Deal under the auspices of fixing our roads and bridges is, again, there's a bait and switch going on. You put all of this together and all of that spending, all of those programs are very problematic. It's going to not be productive in terms of helping grow the economy. It's not going to achieve what we are hoping to achieve. And it's going to just leave us, just like with all that pandemic spending, with a whole lot of debt that's just going to be a pall around the economy for years and years to come.
Wayne, thinking back on your Beyond the New Normal series, and that was a series of papers a few years ago that you did in response to the low growth rates that we were seeing during the Obama era, we couldn't help but think that your blood pressure pressure must have been rising this summer with the debate over the trillions of new spending in the Democrat budget reconciliation bill. So what are your thoughts on the congressional spending spree, and what impact will this massive new spending have on the debt and our future economic health?
One of the things we were trying to do with the Beyond the New Normal, and it's clear that we are not beyond that new normal. We are squarely in the new normal. And that new normal, the idea was, and when it was playing off of it, Larry Summers was saying that the economy is mature, and he was one of the big proponents of this, and that we can't grow beyond 2%. And, obviously one of the greatest presidents of all time, Ronald Reagan. And I think one of the things that made him so great, beyond just having the right policies, particularly economic policies, is that positive outcome. And in the 70s, when he was, running, people were having the same statement. Oh, the economy is mature. We can't grow. We need to just, suffer through this new malaise. And this is just, we need to accept this relative decline. And, President Reagan said, no, right? That, the American in spirit and the American economy can prosper. We just need the right policies in place. And that's correct. And we're kind of back at that it's the intelligentsia will tell you that there's only so far the economy can grow, where demographics are getting older and, all of these, issues that they'll tell you that there's this new normal. Productivity growth is low, population growth is low. We're just going to have to settle for that. And what we're using that as an excuse to implement policy after policy after policy that is completely against what we were recommending in the Beyond the New Normal series of, it's really kind of just fundamental kind of wisdom, right? Where you need an affordable level of government, taxes that aren't burdensome, sound money, free international trade, and regulations that impose the costs that are necessary, but nothing more burdensome than that. And in each one of those categories, the economy is going in the wrong direction. It's for trade that's been going in the wrong direction for many years, spending for many years. It looks like taxes now, which had improved, are going to start going up. Again, monetary policy, all sorts of instability, bubbles, capital misallocation, that's continuing. And those policies are the cause of our low growth. And that's exactly what the Democratic Congress is pushing. If you talk about that infrastructure package, talk about the pandemic spending, all of this is stressing the policies that are holding back our prosperity. And they're doubling down on it. So, in that sense, it's very pessimistic. But I think the optimistic spin is that since it's policies that are creating this, if we change the policies, we can change that outcome and get beyond the new normal. The depressing thing is that we're not. And so we're still in that normal. And to me, the fight is to convince us that that's not the case and to change what we're doing to get beyond it.
So the debate over this Democrat budget reconciliation fight has brought up another topic that you have written about in a past PRI study that we called Making It Rain in California. And that's about the state and local tax deduction. So you're saying members of Congress in both parties who represent high tax, high spending states like California and New York, pushing to try and try to bring back the full SALT deduction. But wouldn't this, Wayne, just be another giveaway to wealthy taxpayers paid for by the working class? What are your thoughts on this debate, and what do you think Congress should do on this issue?
Well, Congress should actually just completely eliminate the SALT deduction, as opposed to we have a cap right now, $10,000 for deductions. There's absolutely no reason why the federal government should be subsidizing state governments when they spend too much money or they tax people too much. And part of the idea of having state governments is that people can choose the type of state they want to live in. Do you want to be in New York? Do you want to be in a Florida, a Maine, a Virginia, California? Each state has different approaches, and people can choose, those that represent their views to some extent. But there's no reason why somebody from California who makes the same amount of income as somebody from, let's say, Virginia, pay less federal taxes, right? You would be in, let's say, in the exact same situation. You have the exact same tax return, except for the fact that one person lives in California, one person lives in Virginia. The California would pay less to the federal government with the full SALT deduction in place than the Virginian, simply because they have to pay more to California. But they've chosen to live in California. And since it's not as if that burden goes away, so you've shifted that burden from the high income person in California to either lower income people in that state or to people in every other state. And so you have this inequitable transfer because of the state government. Plus, you're blunting the effects or the consequences of having high state taxes. If you live in a state and you want to have, high services, you should feel the full cost of it. And if you're not happy, then the state should reform, cut spending, reduce the taxes. To ask taxpayers in other states to compensate for that, that's an inequity. But it also it's part of what's wrong with our total federal tax system. Right? We go back to the beyond the new normal, right? What's the tax policy we want? Ideally, a flat tax, right? But we want a tax that is on the broadest possible tax base and the lowest possible tax rates. Well, if you have SALT loopholes, you're narrowing your tax base and you're raising your rate. As you do that, you create complexities, create inequities, but you also, by having a higher rate, you're creating greater disincentives to work, save, and invest. So the SALT deduction, obviously it's only a marginal contribution, but it's part of the problem of our complex tax system with all sorts of loopholes, making all sorts of resources wasted filling out our taxes, and having a tax system which is decidedly anti-growth. And so that it's actually, from that perspective, it's also part of the problem of having this overly burdensome tax system. So from its own perspective, as well as kind of what it represents, the SALT deduction is not a good idea. And we shouldn't eliminate the cap. And we'll see what Congress does over the next couple of months.
So earlier this summer, you hosted a terrific webinar with Carol Roth about her new book, The War on Small Business, which our listeners probably heard as a recent episode of Next Round. And in a similar vein, you have a new study coming out, the last in our Breaking Down Barriers to Opportunity series, and it explores how government policy has negatively impacted entrepreneurship. You don't want to give everything away, but could you give us a preview of your main arguments in your upcoming study?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's playing off of all of these same themes. But if I could say, Carol Roth's book, The War on Small Business, I'm going to give it a quick plug just because it was really good, and Carol really is the best. So definitely worth the read and worth understanding her perspective, because it's so important that we are making it more difficult for entrepreneurs in this country year after year. So you have politicians constantly, talking about how much we care about small business and how important entrepreneurs are, and they'll talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And what they're actually doing is making it more difficult for entrepreneurship. And the idea of this study was we're trying to look at all of the pandemic spending. And I was trying to look at it not from a public health, perspective, so not trying to ask questions about, whether lockdowns are necessary or not, or get into any of those issues, but just get into kind of just the straight up, what were the economic consequences? How was the money spent? Was it the right amount? Was it spent well? And now that it's been spent, what are the consequences? The same thing with the Federal Reserve has been doing. I mean, one thing I think for me was shocking, and I knew it was happening, but not to this extent. We spent about $5 trillion. Again, just astronomical sums, but we spent $5 trillion between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Most of that's been wasted, spent poorly. And so all that now is a future tax burden. I mean, think of it this way, but just even with today's insanely low interest rates, you're still talking about $100, $200 million a year in recurring costs that we have to bear just revolving that debt. I mean, that's how much we've spent. But what we've also done is the Federal Reserve, and they knew, obviously the Federal Reserve has been expanding its balance sheet, right? It's been buying lots and lots of government bonds, but it's actually bought about almost, again, 55-60% of the total new bonds that have been issued. 60% of that size of those new bonds that were issued are now on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. In other words, the Federal Reserve monetized a vast majority of that debt. That's part of the reason we're seeing the inflation problems that we're seeing. And I think it's one of the things that we have to look forward to, unfortunately, is that constant inflationary risk going forward. I don't think, have gotten through all of it. Hopefully, that monetization will ease, and so the inflation problems will ease. But that's been a response to the pandemic. Well, that creates credit allocation problems, right? So now, if we take all of this all this background and think about it, well, how is that going to impact entrepreneurship? How is that going to impact people's small businesses' ability to thrive and grow? Because small businesses, and this is what the Breaking Down Barriers series has really looked at, is that's not just important in terms of overall growth. It's not just important for productivity. It's also that essential part of the ladder that lets lower and middle income families kind of move up the economic ladder. And we keep breaking that ladder. We keep making it more difficult through high taxes, through regulations, through making credit more and more difficult for small businesses to get. Well, if you go to what the Federal Reserve has done, it's not their intention, but with all of that bond buying, with all of their programs, they're making credit more difficult for entrepreneurs. So the response to the pandemic is now making credit availability more difficult for entrepreneurs. That's going to be an obstacle for entrepreneurship going forward. All of that spending and the taxes, complex taxes, high taxes, are constantly cited as a barrier for entrepreneurs. Well, if you look at what we've done, we've made it more difficult from an entrepreneurial perspective. If you look at all the regulations, like the moratorium on evictions, that's hurt a lot of entrepreneurs, especially those who are owning, apartment buildings, owning apartment units, houses. So what we've done through the pandemic, in the response to the pandemic, is actually going to be felt going forward by entrepreneurs, unless we make changes in a much more difficult environment. And so that's kind of what the study is looking into. And, again, the idea is to kind of take a different perspective on some of these current economic events and kind of showcase something that we all care about, right? Entrepreneurial spirit is kind of built into the American psyche. And I think it's important to connect all of these policies to that negative side in terms of making it more difficult for entrepreneurship. Hopefully in a way to kind of get the groundswell of rolling back some of these obstacles so that we can encourage more entrepreneurship going forward.
So let's turn to another issue being debated in Washington this summer, and that's drug pricing. Democrats and Republicans are increasingly advocating for price controls and other government regulations to try and address the problem of drug affordability. But your latest paper in the Quantifying the Wrong Value series shows us how we can reform the system to ensure that drug prices better reflect patient value. So walk us through how this would work and why your approach would be better for patients and innovation than the model used by ICER that most government officials look to for advice on drug pricing.
Absolutely. Let me start with ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. I think that's one of those organizations. Many people may not have heard of ICER, but it is impacting their ability to get drugs, and that influence, unfortunately, seems to be growing. So I think it's important for people to understand what ICER is and what they're doing, because my paper is very much a response to that. And the idea of what ICER is that they raise a very important question, right? When we look at the prices of drugs, sometimes it's hard to know, do those prices reflect the value of the drug? And typically in markets, right, we know that prices in a competitive market reflect the value. And the example I use in the paper is like the apple market, right? When you purchase an apple for $1 a pound, that pretty much reflects how much people value an apple. And $1 a pound is enough to compensate for all the costs to grow and bring that apple to market. So we have an efficient kind of outcome where the growers of apples and the sellers of apples are receiving compensation that reflects their value, and people are paying a price that reflects the value. Well, we don't have that in drugs. And part of the reason we don't have it is because the market is so convoluted. Now, ICER basically comes in and they say, look, we can do these fancy modeling and we can use fancy terms like qualities and come up with a formula that tells you what the value is. And the way I think about it, I'm a Far Side fan. And one of my favorite ones, there's a cartoon that has a professor standing in front of a chalkboard, and he's doing all these equations, and it ends with time equals dollars. And the little caption is, Einstein discovers that time equals money. which of course is ridiculous. But to me, that's essentially what ICER is doing, is they think they can do these mathematical calculations and they can do these studies and come up with some objective value of how 300 million Americans subjectively feel or value their medicines. And that's, again, where I think that approach is wrong. And what we need to do is we need to come up with a way for the hundreds of millions of people to reflect how they value medicine. And the way you do that is through an efficient market. And the problem, especially for innovative drugs, is that we don't have an efficient market where health insurance, right? Because the cost of innovation is expensive and it's a risk, right? You don't know, kind of going into the future, if you're going to have an illness that requires you to take a medicine, which is still kind of has exclusivity. So you're still paying off the innovation costs of that medicine. So it's a risk, which means this is an insurance transaction. And so that's really where the idea for my two-part pricing model comes from, is that what we want to have is a separate, efficient market for pricing innovation, right? How do we compensate an innovative manufacturer for innovation compared to compensating for the value of safely producing the drug? So if you look at it from the innovation side, which is really where the value issues come in, that's an insurance transaction. People want to buy insurance against the risk that they'll need to purchase an expensive medicine, right? So the insurer then needs to negotiate with the manufacturer to provide you with access to the drug through that negotiation. And the study goes into great details about this, but there's every reason to believe that that would be a very efficient negotiation where they can negotiate a price that directly prices innovation. And then through that process, we would actually move toward value-based prices for innovation. And then generic drugs, which are actually the majority of small molecule drugs, the prices for those already reflect the value. We have efficient markets to efficiently value the production costs. It's those innovations that is more complex. So that's the second price, is that we have when you go to the pharmacy and you pay for your medicine, you pay for the production cost, which is going to be much lower. If you look at the price of generics, you're talking about $20, $30 per prescription. So if you separate those two concepts out and look at innovation separate from manufacturing, understand that paying for innovation is inherently an insurance transaction and should be priced into premiums and dealt with in that way, you can come up with a method for the market process to value medicines. And that is a much more efficient way to discover the value of medicines as opposed to the centrally planned way, which is kind of what ICER is doing. I know that's a very kind of complicated answer. Unfortunately, we do have a very complicated system. This somewhat simplifies it. And again, it empowers people to choose the right insurer, and it empowers insurers to negotiate effectively with the manufacturers. And that's the way we get to value-based prices for drugs.
So Wayne, despite all of California's troubles, we've got a drought, we have growing cases of COVID, we have a housing affordability issue, we've wildfires. You're still moving to California. So for those who are hightailing out of the state, tell us why you think California is worth saving.
We're definitely moving to California. California is a special place when we're doing a lot of bad policies. You forgot homelessness is an issue too, right? I mean, there's a lot of problems there, but I think there's a reason why people came to California for so long and it became the biggest state in the country, because there's so much natural beauty. There's so much there. There's Silicon Valley. There's San Francisco. I mean, just San Diego, Los Angeles. There's so much to the state, and California is also it's a leader for the country. So I'm optimistic that we will be able to change policy again. Go back to 1978, right? Prop 13, that whole tax revolution. I mean, I think it's certainly saved. There's no reason we can't save California. It is one of the greatest states in the nation, and I've always wanted to be a Californian, and so to have the opportunity now to move there, we couldn't say no, and I'm going to be optimistic and hope that we can make it a great state and a leader in the country again.
Welcome to the Golden State, Wayne, and thanks so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.